Welcome back to this latest episode of Japan's Top Business Interviews. I'm your host, Dr. Ex-Story, President, Dale Carnegie Tokyo Training, and my special guest today is Geoffrey Bossiere, who is the president of Shining Prince Japan. Shining Prince Japan, you better explain that one. What is that all about?
So my experience with Japan goes all the way back to college. And I didn't have a chance to study the language, but I got very interested in the history and the culture and even the religion, which I'll explain a little bit later. But the Shining Prince is the academic translation of Hikaru Genji. Mm-hmm. So Shining Prince, Genji. Yeah. And I've always...
From Genji Monogatari.
From the story, Tale of Genji.
Genji,
yes.
right,
So I've always been very interested in that era. And as a consultant, I thought it would make a good name for the company. So I actually have a U.S. entity, Shining Prince Entertainment, which is the focus. And then when I came back to Japan in 2015, established the LLC here, it's Shining Prince Japan.
It's a unique name. I mean, you look at that and go, wow, Shining Prince, what's that about? So that's good. We clarify that for the audience. So, yes. And let's go back a little bit. I mean, why are you in Japan? What have you been doing here? Let's hear some of the context of your leadership experience, and then we'll dive deep into some of the topics.
Sure. So, I mean, I came originally to Japan to visit a friend in university in '84.
Okay.
So it goes back a long way.
Just before the Plaza Accord bubble economy,
correct.
Everything went
so
like
the
crazy.
yen was still 360
60 yen to the dollar, yeah, right.
And I thought it was quite interesting. I didn't have time to study Japanese in university, but I minored in Japanese history. And I was already interested in sort of the East, and my major was in the International Studies Department, comparative religion, with an emphasis in Eastern religion, Buddhism, Hinduism, and so on. And so I was not focused on business, let's put it that way initially. But I graduated, I studied Japanese for 2 years intensively over a 1-year period. And then I came to Japan as an intern through my university, where they had various companies that you work for. And my company was a restaurant, fairly famous restaurant in Ginza called Suehiro.
Very famous.
Steakhouse, yeah.
Very famous.
So I worked for 6 months, and I lived in the company dormitory, and I had no English, no access to English, basically. And of course, in those days, you didn't have the internet. You didn't have very much in the way of magazines, but I had my, Japan Times every day. That's all I had. But it was good. It was a good way to learn the language, and I'd already intensively spent a year. So by the time that was done, I had a good, solid foundation of Japanese. And so from there, I wanted to use the Japanese. I did teach English for about 8 or 10 months. And then I decided I needed to get experience in the business world. And so I became a salesperson for right here in Akasaka, as a matter of fact.
Just down the road, yeah.
Just down the road. For a company that's now called Adecco.
Oh, okay.
It was then called Adia Staff, which is a Swiss company.
Staffing
is like manpower.
Manpower, temporary staffing.
So I went around and sold to corporations, basically cold call, knocking on doors.
This is to Japanese corporations.
To Japanese corporations. And it was...
And this is what year is this?
87.
So you're coming through the door in 87, a foreigner, talking about sales to Japanese companies, cold calling. It must have been a sensation for them.
Well, and so it's interesting because the president of the company was very interested in trying new things. And he'd already hired one American who was a Mormon missionary.
Okay.
And I had good Japanese, but he had flawless Japanese. And he'd done really well. And so I was the second in that line.
Okay.
And it was a great experience. I mean, in terms of learning how to write correspondence and, really, I have some interesting stories, but I won't go into the details of those.
Well, in that cold calling, were you just doing tobi-komi, just turning up on the doorstep, or you were calling them first?
Most of the time, just
turning up.
Yeah.
Wow. That's fantastic.
And of course, we didn't have Google or anything, so I had my little map, and I got to know Tokyo literally station by station.
Right.
But I only did that for about a year, and it improved my Japanese dramatically. And so I ended up looking for work, and I got multiple offers, and ended up working for a securities company as the assistant to the exec VP. And this is a small securities company in Ginza.
This is a Japanese company?
Japanese company. Yeah, Japanese company.
Multinational, yeah, Japanese.
Called Dainana Securities.
Okay.
And in those days, securities firms and banks were still separate,
Yep.
just like in the U.S. And then now they're all sort of part of the same group. So we would have been part of the Bank of Tokyo group, which is now Mitsubishi.
Which is gone, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
But it was an interesting experience. I studied for my sales. It's called the Gaimuin Shikaku to sell securities.
In Japanese.
And
Well
that
done.
took me 5 tries, but I
Well
finally
done.
passed.
Oh, well done.
Yeah.
Is that a multiple choice question, or you actually have to
It's
write
multiple
kanji?
choice.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
better
yeah.
than
You have to read
write
it, that's
write
all, yeah.
everything. You got to be able to read. Yeah,
You have to be able to
exactly.
read it,
Not
yeah.
easy.
So yeah, it was a good experience. And I did that for a couple of years. And the exec VP was very interested in Hollywood and in film. And he'd been to Harvard as a business school graduate. And
There wouldn't have been too many. Harvard graduates in
pretty
Japan
rare.
would have been, because A, they can't afford it, and B, the English is too hard, and C, their companies don't think of sending them to Harvard, right? So
exactly.
unique person.
He was unusual. He lived in Europe. He lived in the UK for many years, represented companies like Xerox.
Right.
And then, so he hired me to help him, and we got involved in a lot of things, but probably the one that had the biggest impact on me was an investment we did in a small company called Outlaw Productions in Hollywood, which was a brand new company.
So this is the securities company investing in this.
Yeah, basically seed financing. So he was one of his former Harvard buddies. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And they financed their films by pre-selling video rights, which was the thing. And this was right before Columbia purchased Sony. Sony purchased Columbia, right? So the first film that they did was about $1 million budget, and it ended up they hired an unknown writer director, and the film went to the Sundance Film Festival. It was then called the U.S. Film Festival, right around this time, end of January, and it won the audience prize. And then 5 months later, it won the Grand Prix at Cannes Film Festival.
Gee.
And it was called Sex, Lies, and Videotape by Steven Soderbergh.
Wow.
So and he's the same age as I was. We were both 26, I think, at the time. Or 20, no, I was younger then, but 23 or 4. But so that led to one thing to another. We started getting a lot of interest from Hollywood companies, especially after the Sony purchase of Columbia. And that got me connected into the Hollywood sort of world. I started reading Variety magazine, and I was always interested in film. So that kind of got me in that direction. I'm taking the long route here. We got pretty well connected. A lot of different high-level people in Hollywood had come here looking for investment from funds, even from Australia, actually. We had a Village Roadshow people here.
Okay.
And so after a couple of years of doing this, and it wasn't just film-related. There was a lot of real estate-related investment, and we had some funds in the UK that I helped work on. And it was quite interesting work. But I wanted to take my previous college experience, which was not business oriented, and get some business oriented experience. So I went to get my MBA.
Okay.
So I applied to go to various business schools. In the end, went to UCLA because of the connection, and that was very helpful. So it was a great place to be if you're interested in entertainment. And as far as your networking and so on, I already had a lot of great connections as a result of that. So I was very fortunate. I was hired by 20th Century Fox as a summer intern. And then in my senior year, I graduated a little bit early, actually, and then started working and discovered just through the grapevine that the head of Fox Japan was leaving. And someone that I had a previous cohort, or not a cohort, but a previous graduate a few years before me, had originally introduced me to Fox. And so I reached out to him not knowing that he was the one who was going to be appointed as the new GM.
Oh.
And so he put me in touch with the people, and I interviewed, and they're like, oh, didn't know you spoke Japanese, right? So they sent me to Germany for a couple months to train, and then they sent me here. And it was an extraordinarily valuable experience because
This is Murdoch's company, right? So
Murdoch's
And
Fox.
did you get to meet Murdoch and then he
Eventually, yeah, in the late 90s.
I'll have to hear about that later. Yeah, he's a legend.
He is, yeah. So Fox Theatrical, this is the film distribution to cinemas, And it was a very old company. I mean, it'd been in Japan for 70 plus years already and had a very ingrained culture, as you might imagine. And it's not just the Fox culture, which was a big part of it from the US, but Japanicized, if you will. So, and my role was a just exhausting role because I was the management trainee, but I was also the general manager's eyes and ears and translator and everything. So everything he did, I did, and I learned a lot. So it was exhausting at the end of every day, but I had to learn things really well because you can't translate it unless you understand it.
Right?
Yeah. So that was that. And then I remember when I was hired, they told me, you could be the general manager in 3 years, and of course that wasn't what I was expecting. And I was thinking I'd be sent off to, Singapore was a possibility and some other small market, but I stuck it out and I was still in my early 30s. So I was quite young for that. But the general manager moved on to a regional role. He moved to Hong Kong. And then they ended up making me the general manager. At age 33.
Wow, that's a big deal.
It is, yeah. So,
and how many people were working in Fox at that time that you were?
So probably about 50 in the whole organization. We had offices in Osaka, and we had just closed offices in Sapporo and Fukuoka prior to that.
Okay.
But in those 3 years, I'd learned a lot, and I was responsible for things like making our operation more efficient. Like we got rid of our local distribution, which was sort of double bookings, if you will, in local cinemas. Instead of just distributing in the 9 key cities, we hired more people on the sales side and we went direct. So it was a big deal for the company. So we actually grew the company. And I was, again, fortunate in the timing. And, they were not 100% certain that I was the guy, right? I was interviewed by all the most senior people in the company. And they're like, well, I'm not sure. He's a little green. So finally, after Paul, my previous boss, left, I just basically raised my hand and said, look, make me the GM for a year. And if I'm not successful, I'll leave.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So they took that as a good sign. And they signed me to a 5-year deal, but it was a 1-year option initially.
Okay.
And I was fortunate because the first year was 97, calendar year 97. And that year we had a film called Titanic, which even to this day is the highest grossing non-anime film in cinema history in Japan.
Is that right?
Yeah.
In Japan?
In Japan.
Wow,
yeah.
Okay.
Even Avatar. Avatar broke the record in every other market in the world except Japan. So I'm not quite sure the reason for that, but...
All those blue people.
All those blue people. No, it did really, really well. It still made like $175 million, but Titanic was like 260. So it was a big. So anyway, so it was a good start. And in terms of the management and dealing with the staff, obviously, initially, it was probably a little bit hard for the staff to buy into this young, general manager.
Especially being a sort of kaban mochi bag carrier for the GM. You're always seen as like assistant to the GM,
Right. Well, and I had been promoted to assistant general manager, actually.
Right.
Prior to that,
but in their mind, you're also like, carrying his bag, you're his assistant. Yes. You're just, sharpening pencils in their mind.
Well, I mean, not quite, but
running things, in there. But I'm just saying, I'm just drawing out the exaggeration of the scene here.
Yes.
You got to go from that role to actually being the boss in a very short space of time, right? So how did you get that adjustment?
Well, there was a period of time just prior to that where my previous boss had left. He basically, that's the way he accomplished it. He just moved to Hong Kong without permission. He just moved the regional office to Hong Kong. He just did it. Fait accompli.
Wow. Okay.
So there was a number of months there where it wasn't decided what we would do, that I started taking on the role. So there was an adjustment period, but definitely, and to put it more in perspective, your perception about being a kaban carrier, bag carrier, and pencil sharpener, they knew me. They knew me much better, maybe even than they knew the head at the time. Because of the language, probably, and because I was the interface. But I think also the key management, meaning below me, the head of sales, the head of marketing, and the head of finance, had grown to trust me. And I don't take credit for this. I think actually it was me and my boss prior to that. But up until we arrived, the management before us was didn't allow for clarity in terms of what we had in this market. And combine that with the fact that the film business is a very hit or miss.
When you say didn't define clarity, what does that mean?
Okay, so first of all, there was a very negative view of the local office for whatever reason. And I think that's because the previous head did not convey all that was going on.
Okay.
And
sort of Castle Japan, was it?
That's just my perception. I could be wrong. I could be wrong. But what happened was when Paul and I arrived and started delving into things, we started to understand with real clarity not only the relationships with other companies, but the value of the team and people who'd been criticized before or had not seen as valuable before because of their style perhaps, became valued, became very valued. So I was seen along with Paul as bringing that prism, that clarity to the office. And so for them, there was already a big feather in my cap, if you will.
And it could have been the other way too. If your boss had been the executioner,
right,
you would have been his
I would have been executed.
Well, no, you would have been his handyman,
right?
To execute people or to
and
send
I would have
down
been
the
seen in much more
rockets.
negative light.
Yeah, you would have been seen as a part of the brutal,
That's
brutal
true.
system that they're going through. But that flip made it okay, we're resurrecting the good guys and gals are back.
That's a good point. Yeah.
So that was good for you, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so. So and I've always considered my career, all these things that happened that seem unrelated, they just feel like they're all connected. Like one thing just led to another, And so I started a 5-year journey as the general manager, and we had an extraordinary run. So even to this day, I mean, again, the film business is very hit or miss. So you can have the way you stay afloat in the film business, putting aside home entertainment and television, is you have to have at least a few hits per year. And those 1 or 2 hits out of, say, 15 titles, the rest are losing money. Now, they're not losing money in the long run because you've got home entertainment, but theatrically they were. And we had a good run. Now, that's not to say that we were gloriously profitable all those years, because the overall studio business is incredibly low margin. I'm not sure if you're aware of that, but it's probably somewhere between 2 and 5%.
Jesus, that's not much, is it?
On an ongoing basis. Now,
on millions and hundreds of millions of dollars.
Hundreds of millions of dollars.
Costs, and you're making a margin like that. Wow.
At least in those days.
In the theaters, anyway.
In the theaters, and actually, no, the overall studio, I think.
Even with the whole shebang.
In those days, even the overall studio was not like super profitable. You'd have a few good years, but then you could have lean years. So you have to take, what is it over a long period of time?
So did that sort of war chest from Titanic help you to sort of weather some of those years, or they just whipped the profit out of it and sent it back home? And
it definitely lent a glow of and we had an extraordinary run with that film. So whereas all the other markets, Germany, France, UK, that were on par with Japan, roughly, we were all earning similar amounts week by week for the first few months. And they all sort of petered out at 50, 60, 70 million. And then in the end, we had what I like to refer to as a smile curve, because we ran for almost a year. And after summer, we released in December, and after summer, we started going up 2 and 3% every week for weeks and weeks and weeks. So, I mean, the home office was
like... This is due to your genius marketing.
Oh, of course, right. All due to that. And we did have a very good team. And I don't take credit for that. I feel like part of it is seeing the value of what you have, making them believe that they're valuable. And that was also something I learned from our home office, because in those days, the head of Fox at the chairman level, the whole studio, but even the head of international, would often tell the Fox team, you guys are the best. And they didn't just say that, they meant to us all, worldwide, that you guys are the best in the world, and that we were pretty successful in those days. And Japan in particular was a standout because it was the biggest market outside the US. So after a while, you start to believe that, and I think that that's a good philosophy.
And did the Japanese
to breed
believe it?
positivity? And I believe, I'm not sure if at every level they did, but I know that at the important levels, the division heads, we all believed it. And we would get these pitches from senior management, or not pitches, but lineup, explanation of what's coming. And they, these guys would make every film sound like God's gift to film, And so it was very exciting.
Excellent persuasive power.
Yeah. And it was never the case. I mean, the sad thing about Japan from a film distribution perspective is no matter how much you love film, and let's say you live in Australia or you live in the US, and you love all sorts of genres, you like, stupid comedies, you like all this. In Japan, those comedies just don't work. So if you've got a large number of big comedies or just difficult subject films, they don't translate and they don't do well, and they're very hard to market. So that's kind of frustrating. The ones that do work are, science fiction, drama, tragedy, that sort of thing. So
Action
Titanic,
films, maybe?
Titanic, all wrapped into one, or Aliens or Star Wars or any of these things. So that was a good, interesting experience overall. And then ultimately, I decided that I didn't want my entire career to be defined by Japan. And I had 3 young kids. Well, I just didn't want to be pigeonholed so that my entire career, it would make taking on a senior role in the US later on more difficult if you're seen only as,
So you didn't see a niche for yourself here as someone who is able to operate in the language at a very high level for corporates who basically can't find people like that very easily. You thought that the path forward wasn't going to take you very far here, so you have to go back to the States.
It's not that so much. I mean, it was a combination of things. Part of it was my family.
Right.
And even though my kids were at, American school and were, it was international, I didn't want just that for them. I wanted them to have experience in the US, and just to be able to grow up in the US. And I also felt, so I looked at other opportunities, and then within the company, you can succeed for a certain period of time. And I'm sure we would have gone full cycle again and done really well. But there was probably 1 or 2 year period where we had a series of films, one after the other, that just weren't doing very well. So it was also adding to the level of frustration. And I felt like it would be a good opportunity to, if I did want to work on a worldwide basis, to seek other roles and see what. And I found a really great role that put me as a head of international worldwide for a company. And so I left a few months before my 5 months.
This is in the film industry?
Also in film, yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, so that was back in the US, and that was a great contrast to management in Japan versus what the world is like in Hollywood or somewhere else. Because here in Japan...
Does it translate? Was there things you could take from the Japan experience and import that into American business culture, or no?
Well, not from a cultural standpoint so much, but from a business practice within the industry, sure.
Like what?
Well, I mean, but the non-cultural stuff, which is what I see is the real standout here, is in Japan, we have a tendency to get into meetings, and it's not about the ego and the individual executive, or it's all about the end goal for the company. And we make decisions, and I say, I would make the decisions, but they would be in consensus with the management locally, with the management in home office, and with the team in general. So it'd be kind of a
homogenized decisions, basically.
Homogenized decisions, and sometimes they were made, they would go against what maybe the local team would believe, but that was pretty rare. But what I noticed getting back into the US was that Hollywood in particular was all about spin, where it didn't matter whether something was true or not. If your film was performing well or wasn't, or, you had to decide what you're going to do based on, for example, reactions and so on to a film. in the US, it was all, even within the company, that when you're talking to other executives in a senior management meeting, you have to spin it. And I was not good at spinning it. I was good at telling the truth as to what the reality was. So it was a tough adjustment.
You got to amp it up for
You got to
audience.
amp it up, yeah.
Right.
So it was an interesting cultural experience. And after 3 years of that, and it was a great experience because I was able to travel around the world and got to know all these markets around the world, and we were quite successful. In the end, I decided that I wanted to get back to my Japan roots. So I stayed in the US, and that's when I established Shining Prince Entertainment, and I became a consultant for initially Dreamworks, and then that grew, to a whole bunch of, I did Paramount, IMAX, and so on.
And a consultant to what, for penetrating the Japanese market?
For the Japanese market, yeah. So in the case of Dreamworks, I was shifting from theatrical to home entertainment, and it was a pretty big shift, obviously, because it's a different business model. But a company here called Kadokawa, which is a publishing company, had started its own entertainment division, and it bought Nippon Herald and cinemas and all these things. And they invested a huge amount of money in Dreamworks. I think it was $100 million. And so to manage, initially it was just the video rights and the theatrical, I think they took on some theatrical rights later on, but to manage that business was my role, basically. So
as a consultant.
As a consultant. So, I mean, so throughout all my years as a consultant, I had various roles, some of which were basically integrated into the company. Like Hulu, for example, we established Hulu here, and that was almost a 4-year role. And I wasn't just, I was a consultant technically, but I was the signer and, local legal representative.
Sort of almost like an interim executive type of role. Think of it
Exactly,
like that?
exactly.
Okay.
So, I mean, and that was good. I mean, probably the greatest experience of my career was with working at Hulu. Because of the people and the, I had learned.
It was new?
Well, partly because it was new, but because the people were so, the smartest group of people I've ever worked with. I mean, honestly, and I know it's not about, credentials, but you had all top Ivy League MBAs. It raised my game for sure, but
these are Japanese.
No, these are all U.S. executives who established
here.
No, so I was here. In fact, the whole Hulu experience was because I went to them and said, "What about Japan?" So they didn't have anything here. Okay. They were thinking about it, but Hulu was.
There are a bunch of really smart people operating in the States with Hulu there, and you've said, "Hey, you've forgotten about Japan."
Well, yeah.
I can help you.
Not so much as you've forgotten about it, but they had, I think Japan was ranked 15th in the world for them.
Right. It's a long way down the list.
It is, in terms of viability to launch a Hulu.
If you want to be successful as a leader, do the Leadership Training for Managers course. All companies need people who can both manage and lead. Leading people screams out for real skills in communication, dealing with all different types of people, being excellent at innovation, planning, delegation, handling mistakes, doing performance reviews really well, and inspiring and motivating the team. Do the Leadership Training for Managers course now in either Japanese or English. Are you doing business with Japan? Do you really know how things work? Japan Business Mastery provides the answers. Do you have the right networks and know how to create them? Do you know how to get on the same wavelength with Japanese buyers? Do you know what being trustworthy looks like from the Japanese perspective? Japan Business Mastery is based on more than 30 years' experience in Japan and will become your go-to guide. Want to succeed in Japan? Buy Japan Business Mastery now.
And so after we started doing the research, and in those days, Hulu was still a pure ad-supported, browser-based, model that didn't have a premium service. There was no subscription. It was just a free ad base. And it was a really sophisticated ad model that you could target people incredibly well. So we started introducing this to the Japanese broadcasters and agencies and content owners. And they were really excited. I mean, it was like, wow, this is how smoothly it worked. This is around 2008. And so it wasn't initially, but we evaluated it and we realized that the advertising market just wouldn't support it. The cost per thousand of ads was nothing compared to the US. And the ads that we were selling in the US were on par with TV ad prices, on a CPM basis.
And why was it so cheap here? Why couldn't you get the same command of pricing here?
I mean, honestly, I'm sure you're aware that a lot of the businesses and industries here are run for the long term and from the perspective of these are our businesses and they don't change and evolve very quickly or easily. And the television broadcast industry is a classic example of that because it was all about the agencies, all of whom cross-sharehold each other. They would create their TV product based on sponsorship budgets. And that's how things got done. And so whenever a new entrant, such as pay TV in the 90s, entered, they kind of played along, but they didn't play along. In other words, they wouldn't allow, I know you interviewed the head of Nielsen at one point, but in those days, Nielsen had tried and failed, and it was still, I don't know where they are today, but it was, what's it called? Video Research, which is owned by all the agencies. And the way they control the ratings meant that the pay TV, satellite and cable channels were limited. So in all those years of television developing, even in 2008, 2009, when I was starting with Hulu, advertising was still 85% terrestrial and 15%. And in the US, as you know, it totally changed. It blew everything apart where the broadcasters had a much smaller share and the pay TV providers were very successful. So that was an example of that. And I noticed there was interest, but I almost felt that if we had chosen certain paths, like if we'd gone with certain agencies, for example, who really were keen on supporting us, that we would have been partnered with and then squashed. That's personally what I think. I mean, it's just because it's not in their interest.
Well, there's no shortage of cases of, companies here as a defensive mechanism, buying into companies, buying companies to kill them off so they can't compete. So that's not an unusual thing in Japan. There's plenty of examples of that. So what happens after Hulu?
So with Hulu, I'm still in the US and I'm still commuting back and forth once a month for about 10 years. So 120 months, I think 110 trips, something like that.
Okay.
So back and forth.
You
and
must have like a squillion air miles after
I did at one point, yeah. And so, but I worked for Netflix for a little while. And it's funny because I met with Netflix. I met with the current, he was the chief content officer at the time. I think he's co-CEO or CEO now. And I met with him for lunch, and this is like 2012. And are you interested in developing in Japan? And we just launched Hulu, and I'm done with that now. I'm back in the US. And he was like, well, we're never going to launch in Japan, basically. I mean, and I think the reason was because he knew the Japanese market and all the difficulties that came with it, the amount of money that you have to invest. And even Hulu did not have an easy time. You have a huge investment. And as you know, Hulu was eventually sold, or maybe you don't, to Nitere, to NTV. So, which I think was a mistake, but it was a long-term game. But in the end, Hulu Japan was the only territory launched worldwide. It never launched anywhere else. And so I did Netflix, and I tried to develop businesses that would build long-term revenue rather than just consult. So for my company. And I was successful in doing that with a number of different, one is an Australian company that I've been working with for about 10 years. And then I also most recently took on a role with HBO Max. And that was, again, partly because of the Hulu people. The founder of Hulu ended up becoming the chairman of Warner Media, all of the, and they were trying to establish HBO Max internationally. So for Japan, I was brought in for just a year and a half, a little less than a year and a half, a year and 4 months.
Again, as a type of interim executive, or
as an interim managing director.
Right.
So, but again, that was interesting because unlike Hulu was owned by Disney and Fox, but did not have offices here. So we were building from scratch.
Right.
In the case of HBO Max, they have a Warner Media here.
Warner's been here a long time.
And Warner's been here a long time. So
long time.
I think the idea at the time was the CEO of Warner Media, because he was a Hulu tech guy, wanted to establish similarly to, a real culture, a more of a tech culture for HBO Max than a media culture. And in doing so, he wanted to develop it in parallel, sort of hand in hand with the local office. And so that worked okay. But as you may know, Discovery came along, and there was this, even our CEO was blindsided, had no idea what was going on. And he was out, basically. He stayed on an additional year, but that whole shift has been huge for now Warner Brothers Discovery. So I continue with my roles. I've developed a couple of European companies that work in production. And I've also, because of my HBO experience, we actually greenlit a couple of HBO Max originals and production. So I was getting much more involved on the production side and development. So I started developing my own project, very early stage, too early to discuss here, but we'll see where that goes. Yeah.
So thinking about your time here, you've been in different iterations here, leading companies. So if you think, over the years, looking back, and well, even currently now, what things have you found work well to get teams engaged?
So, it's interesting because in the early experience, I would say the experience with the largest organization was Fox, for sure. And getting them engaged, I think part of it was getting buy-in in terms of what it was that we were doing. And initially, there was almost a culture of fear. So you had to transform that culture of fear, which, as I described earlier, was a big part, maybe even unknown part of what I was doing in the first few years. But beyond that, there was just building trust, I think, is a question of engendering, having integrity, for one thing, in yourself so that you do what you say. And if you do that consistently, people will trust you. And also an openness, an open door policy. So either being amongst the staff, in our case, we had separate offices, but always having your door open and making it clear that, and having a relationship really with all of your staff one by one, individually.
You're in a very flamboyant industry. You've got superstars, actors, actresses, you've got big budgets, you've got, incredible production values on these movies, etc. So it's very luxurious sort of industry, I guess. So
from the outside, yes.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying, from the outside. So internally, did people feel a lot of pride in what they're doing through the quality of what they're delivering? Was that one of the things to coalesce people together? Was that something you'd work and people really get behind it because they feel proud? Hey, this is what we're doing here.
Yeah, I wouldn't say that's something that the head of the company is developing specifically, but I think that's a natural outcome of what the product was. It was a high profile product, particularly film. And then of course in Japan, there's a huge portion of the population that just doesn't pay any attention. Japan has one of the lowest per capita film going audiences in the world.
Really?
Yeah, I think US and Australia is probably 5, 6, 7 films per year. In Japan, it's barely over 1.
Really? Okay.
Yeah.
So you weren't having sort of,
And that includes the big blockbusters, by the way, where everybody
goes. I was imagining, you're all getting done up in your tuxedos and having red carpet events, and stars come through to promote the movie, and the staff get to meet them. And
there is that.
That must be, if you're a Japanese employee, you get to meet Tom Cruise or whoever it might be. It's like, wow, that's got to be surely engaging for people.
Yeah, and I think it's obviously limited to the publicity staff, and and then you, as a member of the team, regardless of what position or department, you'd be able to come to the press conferences and feel a part of it. And so, yeah, that was definitely one of the more exciting parts. And I think Japan is a little different from many European countries because big stars would come through and they don't have the local connections that they might in, say, Paris or London or something, or even Berlin. So we would end up hosting them more, and we would invite quite a number of the staff as kind of a reward to some of these dinners, you know. So, yeah.
That's got to be fairly engaging.
Yeah.
And you mentioned before, you know, you're in a creative area, and okay, you're the workhorses in the background who are actually making all this happen. And, you know, this is glossy at the top level here, and we're down here in the trenches, you know,
right,
hand-to-hand combat, trying to make all this pay for itself. In terms of what have you found works well to get people to come up with ideas? Because you're in a creative industry, it's a lot of competition. You've got to try and come up with something differentiable, I'm sure, stand out to make the marketing work or make the branding work or whatever. What did you find work well to get ideas from the team as opposed to what, you know, you're pushing down into the team?
Yeah, I mean,
get it the other way.
If anything, we did get a lot of superimposition, I guess you will, from the head office as to this is our worldwide campaign, and this is how you how we would expect you to release it, and a lot of that just gets used. I mean, worldwide. Okay. And Japan also sometimes, if it fits, if it works, if it's the right way to sell a product.
You have the option here to say no.
Yes, but it takes quite a bit of convincing in some cases. Now, we had not just marketing campaigns, but sort of publicity events, things that they might not have agreed with as the way to go. For like Star Wars, for example, we had a case where we felt it was going to be valuable to do what we called a fan festival, like at the International Forum. So it was going to be like two showings of, I don't know, 5.5, it's like 11,000 people total. And we're going to bring the producer and some of the
everyone dress up in
actors.
Star Wars gear.
Well, yeah, and then there was going to be like Darth Maul was there, you know, and he did some stage choreographed actions, and then they sat down and asked questions. And I guess the Home Office felt that it was not going to work, that it was a disaster waiting to happen, that it just, because they don't know and understand Japanese culture and the way these things are done, and they're always done extremely thoroughly and with great care. And
we got a whole cosplay thing happening here, right?
Yeah,
so we encourage people, please come in your Star Wars outfit.
Exactly.
That'd be like great. You know?
And it turned out to be a tremendous success. And so just that, and then, you know, there's other things where not all film companies function the same. And a lot of times we would have a difficulty because, you know, you're dealing with talent as well. So you might have like a film like Moulin Rouge, for example.
Baz Luhrmann.
And Baz, by the way, is almost like a good friend. I mean, he came for Romeo and Juliet. He actually called me up and said, you know, I want to learn Japan. Take me around, show me all the magazines and everything, you know. So we developed.
He did Romeo and Juliet, right? That opening scene where they're at the gas stand, and you got the rednecks and the sort of, you know, the low riding car, and the boot comes out of the car and the spurs.
You remember very well.
Oh, that was to me. I thought, wow, that's so stylish. You know, I mean, Baz Luhrmann is he's very stylish guy, right? But just the encapsulation of that scene in my mind was like, that's something, you know.
It is.
I really admire that.
It was a great film, I must say, and but films like that, you know, that actually did quite well. And part of that was Leonardo, and he was new at the time. But Moulin Rouge, for example, just how do you sell it? I mean, and so I don't remember all the specifics of it, but I remember that we didn't feel that the international campaign was doing it justice, and we came up with a completely different campaign.
And is it the point there is, are these ideas coming out of your head and you're directing the team, or the team are coming up with ideas, hey, I think we can take this, let's Japanize it this way, so to speak, and make it locally relevant? How is that?
Well, I would say that I don't, it's not that I don't have input, because I would definitely have input and have ideas, but I'm not the head of marketing. I'm not the one who's, but we would all share ideas and we would come up with things that we felt. And of course, it's hard for me to get behind an idea that I don't believe in. So, but it's a very interesting sort of business because you get very involved in the creative and putting trailers and storyboards together and getting all that approved. And me being the primary interface, you get very involved, or at least as far as
you're the guy who's going to
convincing.
explain it to headquarters why we're not following the plan. Right?
Well, yes and no. It would get explained in a certain way, and then I would step in and add to that.
Okay.
And a lot of times
I would explain in a certain way by your Japanese team that was insufficient to convince them.
Yeah, for example, we'd prepare a campaign, and they would prepare a cover note explaining this is our direction, and I might take it over and say, look, let me add some
context.
things and send it on.
This is the shorthand.
So they knew I was behind it for one thing.
Here's a shorthand version. Let me give you some more context to that to explain why we're going to do it that way. Right.
So but other companies later on after that, I think that was late 90s, early 2000s, and Disney, for example, was able to change their structure a little bit. So many of the studios in those days were siloed. So you had theatrical and home entertainment and television, and they were all like fighting with each other. Who's the profit center, and so on. But in reality, we're all at the same game. We're all trying to make money for the same product. So Disney was successful at least in spreading out the responsibility and giving the local and the regional more say. And they actually encouraged, and they had some campaigns from out of their Japan office become so successful, or at least were liked so well, that they ended up getting used worldwide. Okay. So like, I think Pirates of the Caribbean, one of them at least was such a campaign. So, it's good to use all the resources at your disposal, I think.
And you talked about trust before being important, but what did you do apart from walk the talk that you mentioned to build that trust with the team? Because again, you went from being bag carrier, inverted commas, to the boss, to be the boss.
Yeah.
And then you got to build your own, you are who you are.
Right.
And they know who I am. And we've built some trust there through interactions, but then I have to, dissipate that through the whole organization to get everyone to trust me. So what did you find worked well to build trust?
Well, I mean, I think, as I said before, integrity, having integrity, doing what you say you're going to do, and following through is
here's
key.
a point I'm interested in.
Yes.
You mentioned before about the American culture of basically spinning, amping everything up, right? So it's like over exuberation, exaggeration perhaps. That's the culture. And yet here we are in Japan, where it's actually the opposite way. It's like humble and don't stand out and undersell yourself and, don't be a big talker. And so you've got these really amazing contrasts. So, how does that sort of work? How were you able to sort of navigate those two worlds?
Yeah, I don't actually recall or see that as being a conflict. I mean, for some reason, maybe it's because we were all in the film business and people joined that world because they were passionate about it. So, but that was a difference. We can get into that later, but the difference I wanted to discuss a little bit if it came up was the difference between an established culture and one that you're creating on your own,
we'll
right?
Talk about that then.
But in the case of Fox, it was a very established, very traditional, and the way you did things was all basically set. You released on certain days, and it's very hard to change that. The way, the relationship you have with the exhibitors, and the systems that you use for selling the product, and even the way the revenue share is done is like a genius system that the Japanese have come up with that works very well. When films do well, you do well, and so on. But getting back to your question about the culture, I think, there were certainly staff within the company that didn't fit that mold. But I don't.
The mold of what? Exuberance, or the mold?
Well, no, that didn't fit that mold of exuberance. There would be much more
conservative,
quiet, conservative. But they understood the business, and it was all, one of the things that you don't hear much in corporate America, but you do in Hollywood, is showmanship. It's all about showmanship. And so we would have this beaten into us that, that this is how, even when we go and do a presentation to our exhibitors, it's all about showmanship and flair and, what they call a sizzle reel, and so it's presentation, it's getting people excited and getting them behind, what it is that you're selling.
Well, the point I was trying to make before was, when you're being down to earth, being very solid, and being authentic, right? There's that element of Geoffrey, right? But then Geoffrey has to amp it up and become flamboyant for the headquarters. So for your Japanese staff, are they sort of seeing which is the real Geoffrey here?
Maybe it's just the supposition that we were somehow internally flamboyant. I don't think necessarily was the case.
Okay. All right. So we talk about trust and talk about culture a little bit too, because you talk about Fox. I mean, Warner Brothers, as it turns out, the owner of this franchise 2 owners ago was a man called Yamamoto, who was a Japanese president of Warner Japan.
Okay.
And he actually had
which franchise?
Dale Carnegie
franchise.
Oh,
I didn't realize that.
Yeah. He took it over. Originally, from 63 to about 96, I think. Mr. Mochizuki had the franchise, and Mr. Yamamoto was one of his trainers who took it over. And then, unfortunately, after a year, he passed away unexpectedly, and his wife and son took it over.
Oh, wow.
And I took it over from them back in 2007. So that sort of Warner Brothers connection.
So, and his connection was Warner's Japan or Warner's overall?
Warner's Japan. He was the head of Warner's Japan.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
wow.
Yeah. He had Michael Jackson come to his house in those days.
Oh, wow.
It was that sort of deal, right?
Well, by the way, Michael Jackson Japan was my client for a while after he passed away.
Oh, okay.
But it was all about legal disputes because of money that they had paid. And they were based very close to here, actually.
Were they? Okay. Yeah. Anyway, we digress. But digress. But coming back to culture. So what have you found works well to build a culture?
So I guess when you say a culture, I think companies have their own culture. And I think Japan has its own culture, and those two meet. And each company is a reflection of that.
And you have your own culture too.
I have my own style.
As a leader,
yes.
I mean, as leaders, we want to put some aspect of our culture within the frame of the corporate culture and the Japanese culture.
Right.
And there's the Geoffrey culture, the Greg culture as well. So how did you go about building that?
Well, okay, so a good example of this is not so much about me, because I don't see myself even as a leader, I don't see myself necessarily as a separate, I try to, and this comes sort of from the whole Buddhist idea that we're all interdependent. And this is the big difference between the West and Japan in terms of how it's all about the process and the flow, the creative flow, if you will. And so I don't see myself necessarily, maybe the face of, but not necessarily like my own culture, for example. But a great example is you had all this very established culture at Fox. And then in developing Hulu was, I hired probably the first 20 to 25 people. And one of the reasons I said earlier that I thought this was one of my best career experiences is because I had learned, I'm constantly learning. Even now, it's what I call learn and self-correct. It's my self-corrective flow. And even now, I'm continuing to learn. But years before, I had learned things about the business and sort of agreed maybe to conventional wisdom as to how certain things work in Japan, and maybe that's the way it should be. And when we started Hulu, we basically threw all that out the window. And we said, we're going to do this on our own. We're not going to look for a partner. A lot of the conventional wisdom that I had dealt with before had said, if you're hiring people, you want to hire people who are skilled at what they do and not necessarily just good English speakers. So the culture at Hulu was not defined, obviously, but Jason Kyler, who was the founder of Hulu originally, had created a mission statement. And it was a very clear, very unique, but very clear mission statement about what we wanted to provide. And it's all about ease of use, but it had to be so fantastically pleasure inspiring that I think they used, even in the mission statement, they used a quote from someone who had tweeted this about how the company and the product was, quote, brain spray awesome. That was
brain
spray awesome.
How did you translate that into Japanese?
We didn't use brain spray, but I can't remember exactly. But so here it was. But this is what I was going to say about English speaking and skilled people, and maybe they're not one and the same. Now, obviously, you do have some people who are fully bilingual and are very well qualified. But there was this mentality in my early years in my career that said that, an egoya, somebody who's really good at English, but not necessarily skilled at the role. So I was not convinced that we would be able to find 100% staff who were A, qualified, and B, fully bilingual. And we stuck to that. And my bosses in Hulu Japan and the people that I worked with, Hulu the US, were really adamant that that was the way we're going to go. And we ended up one by one finding an incredible team. Now, there's probably just a few exceptions, like on the customer service team, which we hired our own, that knew some English, but that wasn't their main language. Those were the only exceptions. Every other role, they had to be fully bilingual so that you didn't have to do this conduit thing where it didn't have to go through one person, that each individual person can deal directly with their departments.
So they understand what brain spray means.
So, and they would understand, exactly. So they would understand what brain spray awesome was. But, I think in that regard, just what we pulled off, I think a lot of people felt we weren't going to get there, or that there was just too many things that were going to be a problem. And in the amount of time, all the things that we had to do in terms of the vast amount of content that we had to acquire, everything infrastructure-wise, and I was involved in a lot of these deals, getting promotional deals with big companies like Docomo, or setting up a payment system for the operation, making sure that your interface was, and this is where we went above and beyond, a service in Japan, it was completely bilingual. And even though you might be able to toggle some websites, like Netflix is that way, a lot of services, even Disney Plus, you can't switch in between. All of the product was like Amazon here, for example, even to this day has English audio and dubbed audio, and they're separate. But we had, everything was seamless. So all the product that we had would be fully bilingual, toggleable subtitles, and way more subtitles than we would need. So not just English and Japanese, but others as well. So we went above and beyond, and we learned a lot. I mean, we made some mistakes in the beginning. Our subtitles were too large in the beginning. And strangely, we got a lot of criticism for having a large amount of Korean content.
Oh, really?
Oddly, and this was coming from consumers. Now, of course,
Korean content, geez.
I know. But there are Korean haters out there, right?
Yeah.
And so this was just some of those voices, and we had to deal with that.
Yeah.
Well, now it's a given.
Sort of changed all that, really, didn't it? It was like the first big breakthrough Korean drama in Japan,
that's right,
which really changed.
Which
everything.
was before that, yeah. I remember when the actor Bae Young-jun was at the Grand Hyatt when I was there, and Tom Cruise was also there at the time. And there was a huge line of older women on, Keaki Zakadori outside the hotel waiting. And we all thought initially that maybe it was Tom Cruise, but it was all Bae Young-jun.
Winnie Sonata, here we come.
Yeah.
So, Geoffrey, if you got a call from one of your friends and said, look, I've landed this big job in Tokyo.
Right.
They want me to go over there and run the organization. But I don't know Japan. I don't know how to be successful. I don't speak the language. Give me some pointers, Geoffrey. What should I do? What would you tell them?
I mean, I guess the first thing would be is don't rush into any decisions right away. Listen. Be patient. Listen, and if you don't speak the language, certainly at least try to learn some. And assuming that you don't speak the language, get somebody that you trust as your, like I was to my boss. And actually the reason I was hired that way is that the president of the company was head of UIP Japan in the early 80s, and he had his, who was now the president of UIP. So it was kind of this whole thing. Have somebody there that you trust who can be your eyes and ears. and really listen to what's going on. And I guess there's just so many things I'm going through my mind in terms of what kind of advice that you'd want to give. But listen, but also pretend that you're going to be here forever. And even though they may know you're going to be here for 3 and 5 years, act as though you're going to bury your bones here. Because,
what that really translates to means showing commitment. Is that what that means?
I mean, you wouldn't lie about it, and you wouldn't necessarily say, I'm here for X number of years. You just say, I'm here for as long as it takes, and just be a little bit more vague about it. Because I think if you're coming into a new environment, particularly if there's bad feelings or, bad stuff that happened, or a lot of people were let go under unfortunate circumstances, that sort of thing, and the staff is fearful, you want to make sure that you build a trust, and the only way to do that is to, if they think you're going to be gone in 3 years, they're going to deal with you differently. So you want to make sure that, I didn't plan on leaving at the end of, I guess I was there 9 years, but as GM after 5 years. But one thing leads to another in life, and I've come back, and I'm still in touch with all those people, and they know I'm sort of committed to Japan for life.
What else would you tell them?
The other thing is, everyone thinks they're an expert, right? And in my early years in studying Buddhism and Zen, there was a concept called beginner's mind. And I remember...
Shoshin.
What's that?
Shoshin.
Shoshin is beginner's mind, but there's a whole description of why and how in a business setting you would want to use that. And I remember the first time I kind of won over the local staff was they knew I was like kohai and they were senpai. But I was able to explain to them that, look, so many innovations in this world, so many breakthroughs that happen unexpectedly. And the only reason they happen is because they come from someone who is not limited by their expertise. So so keep an open beginner's mind about something means that anything is possible. Don't just say, well, we've tried this before, it doesn't work, therefore you have to, because things are constantly evolving, and things that couldn't happen 5 years ago could happen today. So that would be the third and maybe only other piece that I could think of is stay open-minded, have a beginner's mind and convey that. And the other thing is I guess, making sure people understand that you're available there and that you're accessible. Because if you're seen as you can't communicate directly, but B, you're not interested in communicating and really getting to know people, it's going to go nowhere.
Finally, what's your definition of leadership?
I would say leadership is a kind of inspiration, being able to inspire so many different things.
Brain spray awesome type
brain spray
inspiration?
awesome. No, that would be too specific.
That's going to stick with me from now on, that one, I got to say.
You should go back and see if you can find that quote. But in terms of leadership, I mean, I'm not even sure leadership is if you can inspire in people all these things, integrity, honesty, and buy-in. And the buy-in, I think, comes from them understanding what the goals are and them feeling like they've participated in coming up with those goals. Then that's a good leader, that you've inspired your team. But I also feel like you're not a separate entity from them. You're sort of part of this growing continuous flow of things that are all interdependent. So if something they do that affects you, something you do that affects them, and it's not just, we're not all just individuals, we're all sort of part of one thing. So if you can think that way about it, I think that's a good leader. Yeah.
Geoffrey?
Pleasure.
Thank you very much for today.
Thank you very much.
Please join us again for our next episode of Japan's top business interviews.